Okay, we can go ahead and get it kicked off while people are kind of still filtering in. For those of you I've not had an opportunity to meet, my name is Kat Viersba. I'm a CU Women's Golf alum, 2001, and part of the Buff4Life Board of Directors and part of our Athlete Support Committee, which is headed up by myself and by Patrick, who's also on here. And hopefully everyone here is familiar with Buff4Life, but you may not be as familiar with the Helen and Arthur E Depression Center that is part of our University of Colorado medical campus down in the Anschutz in Aurora. And really we're working with them today to really get the message out. September is Suicide Awareness and Prevention Month. And so kind of as the capstone to this month on the 30th, wanting to share tools, preventions, and different options we have to ask the right questions and definitely kind of get out there and just help folks. So with that, our mission is to educate and assist CU Boulder athlete alums in all aspects of their post-collegiate life. And really our goal as the Athlete Support Committee is to remove the barriers and make getting help more approachable, remove the stigma behind it, and just really give everyone an opportunity to focus on their complete or their whole health and well-being. With that, I would love to introduce you guys to Alex. I will butcher her last name, so I'm going to let you give her her own last name. But this is Alex, and she's joining us from the Helen and Arthur E. Depression Center.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Alex Yannicone, and I am the Director, of Education and Community Programs at the CU Johnson Depression Center. We serve primarily as an outpatient clinic where we serve adults, kids, and families around anxiety, depression, and bipolar. But we also have this arm of community programs where we provide education around mental health, really with this grand idea of increasing awareness and reducing stigma. So we're happy to team up with Buffs4Life and provide education that hopefully you'll walk away with more tools and tips of what you can do if you are concerned about somebody. I know that suicide is a really tough topic for a lot of people. Most of us have been touched by it in one way or another. So if at any time you need to mute me, you need to step away from the computer, do whatever you need for your own mental health. And if you are needing extra support or help, obviously virtual kind of creates a little barrier there, but please feel free to private message me or reach out to me. I'll make sure that you have my email after all of this as well. But again, as kind of our basis here, we're really trying to give you just some tools to help those that you may have concern. All right, so to kind of kick this off, we're gonna watch a short clip on a gentleman, Kevin Hines, who is a suicide attempt survivor. He now goes around and talks about his experiences with his mental health as well as his suicide attempt, and really has some important messages along with that. So as you're watching this, I just want you to kind of think about what stood out to you, what gets your attention, and then we'll kind of talk about that a little bit afterwards.
We have lost far too many lives traveling the path to this day.
Since 1937, over 2,000 people have died at the Golden Gate Bridge. I feel lucky to be alive every single day. Of the thousands that have died off the Golden Gate Bridge, I am of the 1% who have survived. So I was born on drugs and premature. And then I bounced around from home to home. Nobody wanted to keep me because I was sick. And I got lucky. I landed in the home of Patrick and Deborah Hines. I had a great childhood. I thought growing up that everything's gonna be great. And then at 17, it all came crashing down. If you can imagine feeling that everyone around you is out to get you, trying to hurt you, and trying to kill you, and you believe that to be the truth. From the extreme paranoia, I exhibited symptoms of mania. From the mania came the hallucinations, both auditory and visual. And so with that and the bipolar disorder, I just was spiraling out of control. I vividly remember writing my suicide note. People don't get it. Like, I thought I was a burden to everyone who loved me, because that's what my brain told me, because that's how powerful your brain is. I got off the bus. I walked slowly down the walkway of the Golden Gate Bridge. You know, people rode by me, drove by me, walked by me, and a woman approached me, and she said, "Will you take my picture?" She said thanks, and she walked away. It was that moment I just said, nobody cares. The reality was that everybody cared. I just couldn't see it. I ran forward, and using my two hands, I catapulted myself into free fall. What I'm about to say is the exact same thing that 19 Golden Gate Bridge jump survivors have also said. The millisecond my hands left the rail, it was an instant regret. And I remember thinking, no one's gonna know that I didn't want to die. In 4 seconds, I fell 75 miles an hour, 25 stories, and I hit the water. I was in the most physical pain I had ever experienced, The Coast Guard was amazing. He was just so freaked out that I was alive that he just dove in and brought me on board. The guy said, "Do you know how many people we pull out of this water that are already dead?" And I said, "No, and I don't want to know." The guy put his hand on my forehead, said, "Kid, you're a miracle." My father took one step into the hospital room, and I looked up at him and I said, "Dad, I'm sorry." And he said, "No, Kevin, I'm sorry." And if you think about it, both of our immediate reactions were guilt. Guilt that didn't belong to either of us. And even though I didn't die, I caused people a great deal of grief and pain. Just the day of my attempt still sits within them today. I asked my father if he still feared my death by suicide. He said every time the phone goes off, his first inclination is, Kevin alive? I had that impact on my dad. So after the jump, the road to recovery was pretty long. I had 7 psych ward stays in the next 11 years. I still have all the symptoms I ever had. Mania, depression, psychosis, hallucinations, all that's still there. I just know how to cope with it and I know how to beat it. I built a support network over these years of treatment so that I wouldn't be fighting this alone. So like, it's okay not to be okay. It's not okay not to ask for someone to back you up. To the families who live with the loss or losses of loved ones, they didn't do that to hurt you or destroy your life. They took their lives because they were struggling and in a great deal of emotional and mental pain. Suicide, mental illness, and addiction are the only diseases that we blame the person for perpetually. But people die from suicide just like they die from any other organ diseased. Today, no matter the pain I'm in, no matter the struggles I experience, I do believe that life is the greatest gift we've ever been given. And if you're suffering mentally, don't wait like I did, sitting in denial for so long. Because recovery happens. I'm living proof.
All right, so obviously there's a lot of really important information in that short clip, but is there anything that stood out to anybody of what he said or got your attention? You can either use the chat, or if it's easier, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself as well.
So I think it's interesting that it sounds like people spend time, thinking about and planning suicide. But from those who've survived, the feedback seems to consistently be that when they're in that final moment, they regret it and change their mind and wish they hadn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that statement that we hear is one of the most impactful, right? It kind of tugs at your heartstrings a little bit, and is hard to hear, really, of the instant regret that pretty much everybody felt after they jumped. And the thing that we know about suicide that I think gives us a little bit of hope around that is that most people don't actually want to die. They want to end whatever pain they have going on. So it's a way that we want to shift our own mindset as well, to see what can I do to help with their struggles, their pains, what they're dealing with, to ideally get them to a place where they aren't contemplating suicide. It was mentioned how almost instant that shift in perspective was the millisecond after that choice. So kind of that same piece there. Also feeling like a burden to everyone. I think to kind of to highlight that piece, we often have heard, I think this is shifting a little bit, but we often hear, how suicide is a selfish act and how could they do that to their friends and their family? When the reality really is that for that individual, they really feel that they are such a burden to the people around them that the world would be better off without them. Now, that's obviously a distorted view and not true to friends and family in most cases, but for that individual, it's a very true feeling for them. So I think that is an important piece to bring up. Anything else stand out to anybody? As you're kind of thinking, a few other things just to kind of note that they talk about, we do hear that statement, it's okay not to be okay. We're hearing that a lot more. And I think the message behind it is really great, right? We want people to recognize that it's okay if you're not doing okay, but let's do something about it. When it comes to suicide, so much of our messages have been, if you're struggling, if you need help, reach out, say something, let somebody know that you need help. And we still have that message, but I think we also really need to highlight the importance of if you notice somebody struggling, if you're concerned about somebody, don't wait for them to reach out to you, but really reach out to them as well, so that we're really kind of tackling this from both sides. And since this video, there have been some really great things that have happened at the Golden Gate Bridge. They are in the process of putting up nets, which is a huge victory for advocates who've been fighting for that for several years. We also know that in 2017 alone, there were 278 people who went to the bridge to jump. And out of that, 245 of them were stopped by a group called the Bridge Watch Angels, or police officers who know what warning signs look like and know how to get people to the help that they need. We also have done lots of studies on individuals who have been stopped from attempting or who have attempted and survived. And we see that 90 to 95% of people do not go on to suicide later in life. So what these statistics really show us is that if we know what the resources are, if we know where our help is, not only can we help somebody in the moment, but we can potentially save their life in the long run as well. And Kat mentioned, depending on the culture or environment someone is speaking up can be really difficult. It can be viewed as weak. Absolutely. And so that's why I think it's even more important that, we don't put all of that on the individual. And yes, we want to change that culture. We want to change the way that is, but also recognizing that we can reach out to those and say, hey, I'm concerned about you. Let's figure some things out together to hopefully break down some of those barriers. We do know, another question. So why is mental illness, addiction, and suicide so common? So I'll kind of go through some of these slides, maybe answer a little bit of that. I don't have, go back for a second, a perfect science to this. Mental health conditions, the cause of them is pretty wide. Traumas, stress, genetics, all of that plays into mental health and addiction. And so there's a lot of different causes into what can create a mental health condition or substance use concerns. So there's not a perfect pinpoint of that, but we do know that there are people at greater risks based on some of their experiences and their environment and their history as well. Suicide, hopefully we'll address some of this as we move forward, but we are seeing obviously an increase in suicide, and there's some factors that kind of go into that. And if I don't answer that in the way that kind of makes sense, make sure to circle back to me and I will address it. So with, something like suicide, and they mentioned this in the video of kind of what our reactions are or our thoughts or beliefs. And for a lot of us, this is a very personal experience because we all have different perspectives on this. We've all experienced this in a different way. There are trainings that spend an entire day diving into your own beliefs and thoughts and attitudes around suicide. We are going nowhere near that. But I do think it's important to kind of think, what does come up for me when I hear the word suicide? What is my gut reaction? I'm not necessarily trying to change that, as I know your own experience kind of bases on that, but I do want us to think about how can we change how we move forward? How can we create more awareness, more education, more understanding around this so we can ideally support those who may be struggling with this in the future? And so this next video that we're going to watch shows really what it's like to lose somebody to suicide. For those of you who have lost loved ones, you will absolutely relate to a lot of what they say, but they also have some really important points that I'll discuss after the video as well.
I don't understand why people don't talk about it. I'm not ashamed that my daughter chose that way to not be here. I'm grief-stricken that she's not with me.
I'd left my phone in my room and I had 45 missed calls and I felt powerless.
It was so shocking and so unbelievable, but also before I'd even taken the call, my phone lit up and I knew what the call was about.
I woke up the next morning to two policemen banging on my bedroom window. So I let them inside and they sat me down and they told me that my sister had been found.
I wanted to double check everything, that the right name came up.
The police sergeant started talking to me, and as soon as he started talking to me, it was just like my heart had ripped in two.
It wasn't until quite a bit of time afterwards that the dust began to settle and you kind of realise what's happened.
Physical feeling of going, no, that's my daughter. My daughter is gone.
I got to a point on Jared's birthday where I was worried about myself.
I felt like going to join her.
All the first birthday, the first New Year's, the first Christmas, it all just hits you when you least expect it.
My heart's never felt the same. It was a physical feeling of having a part of me taken away.
I developed agoraphobia, I developed severe anxiety and general anxiety disorder. I developed depression worse than I ever have in my entire life.
Comes and goes in waves of feeling from sadness to, yeah, just of course missing her.
If you can just imagine one night where you've stayed up crying yourself to sleep over someone that's broken your heart, every single time that's happened, all at once. And the feeling's never really gone away.
It broke my heart.
I think the biggest thing that I've taken from this experience is the sort of fragility of life, particularly when it comes to mental ill health and not having services around you.
That mental health is not a weakness.
People to this day are still sweeping this under the rug. People are still not talking about it. People are still pretending it's not happening.
There's nothing wrong about speaking out. There's nothing wrong with having a cry. There's nothing wrong with having a hug. And it's not weak to speak.
So I think dialogue is the key. I think conversation is the key. I think asking your friends if they're okay and then listening is the key.
It's really made me realise how important it is to reach out to any loved ones, to talk about things more, express feelings and just be there for each other.
All right, so again, a lot of really, understandable, if not we can relate to a lot of what they talked about in this video. But a few things I do want to point out. One, this woman mentioned how her own mental health concerns got worse after the loss of her sister. That's not uncommon. We see that people can either develop mental health conditions or their existing mental health conditions get worse after that loss. Along with that, both the mom and the brother mentioned how they had thoughts of suicide themselves after their losses. We do know people are at a much greater risk of suicide once they've lost a loved one to it as well. And I think that's important to note, not even just immediately after, but as the brother mentioned, those birthdays, those holidays, those are all really difficult times for individuals. And then one of the women mentioned how when she got that phone call, she was completely shocked, but she also knew what it was about. And that's not uncommon either, because in most cases, there are warning signs. There's something that we look back and we go, you know what, they did say something, or they were acting differently, or something was off. And so we recognize that, unfortunately, when it's too late at times. But all of their messages were the same, right? They were saying, we need to be talking about this. We need to be listening. We need to be checking in. And not only from their testimonials is that important, but we also know through research that the more that we talk about suicide, the more that we can prevent it. And we're doing a little bit better of a job here, but we still have a long ways to go. Another reason that this is so important is because we know this is of concern. We know the impact that this is having. For every suicide, there's about 30 attempts. That's an estimated well over 1 million people every single year. And that's documented, so we actually estimate that to be closer to double that amount. On average, we lose 132 people to suicide every single day. One way to think of that is to think of a commercial airliner crashing and everybody dying on board in the United States every single day. The reason that always stands out to me is because whenever you see those deadly plane crashes, you see how tragic they are. You see how many people they impact. That same thing's happening with suicide. We just don't hear about it. Firearms do account for about 51% of suicides. That's followed by suffocation and then overdosing. We do know there is some overlap between suicides and mental health conditions. What the CDC has noted is just under 50% of people who have died by suicide had a diagnosed mental health condition. But we tend to just focus on that, and that's all we look at. But what the CDC also found was that there's actually quite a few other contributing factors that can play into this. Suicide is extremely complex. There's not just one thing that leads to a suicide. It's usually a combination and a lot of different challenges that a person is going through. So what we have found is that at the time of their death, about 42% of people were going through a relationship issue. Just under 30% were dealing with a crisis within a 2-week period of their death. Another just under 30% were having some substance use concerns. We know physical health problems can play a big role in this as well. So something that we were able to do now because of a physical health condition, we're not able to, really noting the impact that has on our mental health. Job and financial issues, legal issues, housing problems. All of these are things that we look at as contributing factors. So again, we know that suicide is complex and there's a lot of different things that can fall into it. And just because somebody has a mental health condition does not make them suicidal. I think we know that. Grand scheme of things, it's actually a very small percentage, but we want to look at all of this kind of from a big picture to have a better understanding. In Colorado, and I know some of you may not be in Colorado, but you guys were all here at one point. We do know that we rank 7th in the nation for highest suicides. Last year, we lost just over 1,200 people to suicide, and that's kind of been on a steady increase. We do see that this is a concern not only for our youth, but also for adults as well. And we'll talk more about that here in just a little bit. Looking at this from a national perspective, we see the impact it has as well. So what this shows is that the dark blue states here really represent the states that have the highest rates of suicide. So as a nation, we have about 14 suicides per 100,000 people. So these dark blue states are pretty far above that. The middle blue colored states are kind of just above it, a little bit above it, more towards the average. And then the lighter colored ones are actually below those national rates. So looking at these dark blue states, anything come to mind of why these states may have higher rates of suicide? And there's not a right answer, so don't worry about that. Less exposure to differences. Interesting, yeah, maybe not as much kind of diversity or changes or differences, yeah. And again, there's not a right answer, so you can't get this wrong. There's a lot of different things that can come into play. Social isolation, absolutely, yeah. So that has been kind of discussed a little bit of looking at the ruralness or how rural an area is, there does tend to be higher rates of suicide in more rural areas. And that's a lot of different things that can kind of play into that. We know that just that idea of isolation, right? We don't have as much connection. Thinking about healthcare, access to healthcare in those areas. Also thinking about the idea behind kind of the pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality that tends to happen in some of those more isolated areas as well. So that's definitely another one. Other ones mentioned younger population, identity expression dysmorphia. So again, with these, those are interesting points that you can look up and kind of look more into. There's not a perfect answer to this, but things to kind of think about here. We also know funding for mental health care may play a role in this. DC and New York kind of put the most amount of money into their mental health care, or put quite a bit of money into their mental health care. For example, Colorado, we tend to be in the bottom 5 for funding for mental health care. So that's something that's been identified or discussed a little bit. There's also been some conversations about access to firearms. So not necessarily, who has the most firearms, but thinking about getting a firearm on an impulsive short basis. Some of these states that are blue have easier access within those areas. So again, not a perfect science to this. There's a lot of different things people bring up around this, but just something to think about, and especially thinking about your own states, what there's access to, what supports there are, how this is discussed. Those are all things that we want to just identify and think about for your own communities as well. When we look at this to see who's kind of at a greater risk for suicide, we do see that men die by suicide at 2 times or twice the amount at rate as women do. However, women make twice the amount of attempts. That's usually due to means. Men tend to use more lethal means. We tend to spend a lot of time focusing on kind of our youth when it comes to suicide, and rightfully so. They tend to be a little bit more vulnerable. They tend to be a little bit more impulsive. But when we look at this statistically, by far our highest rates are in the 45 to 54 age range. And it does tend to be white males. And the problem with this isn't talked about much. Most people don't actually recognize the concern there is. By industry, the highest rates of suicide is in construction. And so when we look at that, we don't really talk about that much, and something that really needs to be addressed a little bit more. There are things that are starting to come up around this. There's a website called Man Therapy that's really trying to take a masculine and humorous approach to talking about mental health. At the Depression Center, we have a training on suicide that's specific for workplaces, so that there's more eyes and ears out there as well. So we could do a better job at addressing this for our male population and our, in between that age group as well. We also know that the LGBT community has higher rates of attempts and deaths, where actually American, Hispanic, Black, and Asian rates do tend to be lower. And that's thought to be because of the support and community that tends to be built into those populations. But what we're seeing just kind of across the board is there tends to just be an increase no matter what the population or demographics really are. When we talk about suicide, a lot of times the conversations that have been had or that are having tend to be misunderstandings or misconceptions. So these are all facts that have been researched that we continue to research as we go. And really the biggest takeaway from today is that if we have true concern that somebody may be suicidal, we want to ask very direct questions. And so what that really means is that we are asking questions about their intent. Are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about killing yourself? And really knowing that when we ask those questions, in most cases, it opens up conversations and lowers anxiety for how people are feeling. I think a lot of times we think, well, somebody's just going to lie to us, or they're not going to tell us the truth. And honestly, that's not what we tend to see. We see that people really open up around this. We've also been told for several years, and I know I was taught this all growing up, is that well, if I ask somebody about suicide, I could plant that seed in their head. I could maybe make them suicidal. A lot of research has been poured into that as well. And we know that we can't make somebody suicidal by just asking them about it. It's a lot more complex than that. So really that should hopefully bring down some of our own fears in having conversations about this. We also know that this really is all of our business, right? We all can play a role in this. I think very often we think, well, I'm not a mental health professional, or I don't know much about this. I shouldn't be the one to have these conversations. But what we also know is you may be the only one that they said something to, or is really noticing a concerning change. So we want to equip people with the tools to be able to have these conversations and know that they can make a big difference in this. We also know that most people who maybe think about suicide usually communicate their intent sometime within the week of their attempt. So what that really means is we see warning signs in a short period of when an attempt or death may happen. And I'll circle back to that because that is important. We also know that most young people do not tell an adult about suicide, but they will go to their friends, which we wouldn't have a huge issue with. But what we see is that they aren't getting the support or help that they need. So what we're really trying to communicate with youth is that if we have concern about a friend or ourselves, that an adult needs to be involved and we need to be talking to them about it. Kind of along those lines, we also know that people who talk about suicide do attempt and die by suicide. Excuse me. So why this is important is because we may see things on social media or we may hear things, and sometimes people will say things like, well, they're just trying to get attention. They're not actually going to do anything about it. But the reality is that it's not normal to talk about suicide. So if somebody's posting about it or talking about it a lot, we really want to take that seriously so we can get them the help that they may need instead of doing nothing and really taking a risk in something happening. And then lastly, we do know that suicide is one of the most preventable causes of death, and there's a lot that we can do. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. So one thing we do want to think about are what are the protective factors that there are around suicide, or really just around mental health in general? What are things that we can build up, that we can pull on almost as the safety net for our overall mental well-being? And these are some of the things that we want to think about in those terms. One is thinking, how can I be preventative for myself, for others? How do I address stress? How do I address, some of the anxiousness that I feel? How do I sleep? These things that really play into our mental health. How can I be proactive and really preventative in that, and not so reactive when things are really troublesome? And I'll have Kat at the end talk about some different options and tools you can utilize around that as well. We also know having easy access to clinical interventions, and Buff4Life actually has this, and we'll talk about it here in a few slides, of phone numbers we can call if we are concerned, that we can get help in the moment when we need it. We also know effective clinical care, so having mental health care, physical care, substance use care, whatever that may look like, when we have that in place, that's obviously a huge benefit. And then the ongoing relationship from that, so that if I know that I'm not doing so well, that I can contact my doctor and say, hey, I'm struggling right now. We have this relationship. Can you help me find somebody to talk to or to reach out to? So that ongoing relationship can be really helpful. One of the biggest ones, though, that we know of is what we just call connectedness. This is the support from others, friends, family, these relationships we have in our lives, and really how valuable that is to our overall mental health. And again, another aspect of Buff4Life, where you guys look out for each other, you guys interact with each other, you check in, that in itself has such value. The idea of life skills, so how do I problem solve? How do I cope? How do I deal with conflict? How do I adapt to change? All of that is so critical and important as well. And those are things even as adults that we're learning as we go. Also thinking about our sense of purpose, our meaning in life. I'm a mom, I'm a brother, I'm dedicated to my work, whatever it may be, that is important. And then thinking about culture and spirituality and how that can uplift people as well. So again, these are just things we want to kind of have in the back of our mind of What can I do for my own mental health and for others as well to help support them? Now, when we have concern about suicide, we're going to see some warning signs or some symptoms or actions or behaviors that may be concerning. And so when we're talking about these right here, we're really talking about a change in behavior or an entirely new behavior that we notice. So this may come up in conversation, and it may not be very direct of, I'm having thoughts of killing myself, although that may happen. But we may hear some conversations that are really worrisome, like my family would be better off without me. Who cares if I'm dead anyways? I just want out. Statements that are worrisome, but not necessarily direct in what they're talking about. In behaviors, a lot of times we see an increase in substance use. We may see people looking for different ways to die. Our biggest one is this idea around withdrawing or isolation, where people are really pulling away from things that they used to enjoy or relationships that they used to really connect with. If we see that kind of pulling away and isolation, that's a big concern. We may see too much eating, too much sleeping, too little eating as well. Sometimes people will give away prized possessions almost as a way to say goodbye to those that they really care about. This can come up as kind of uncharacteristic or kind of a out of the norm aggression that may present itself, as well as extreme fatigue. Within moods, we may see increased symptoms around depression and anxiety. We may see people who used to love certain things really finding no interest in it anymore, kind of a giving up, a hopelessness or helplessness around it. We may see an increase in irritability, again, that may not match the environment that's going on. Something happened that's very shameful or humiliating to them may impact this. And at times we can see this relief or sudden improvement. So a quick example would be, somebody's in a deep depression, and then kind of overnight, we see this very, very dramatic shift in how they're behaving. And there's kind of this happiness or contentment that we may see. And so as family and friends, we kind of back off and say, oh, they're doing better. At times that can indicate that somebody has almost become content with their decision to end their life. And sometimes something happens right after that. So it's just something we want to be in tune with if we're noticing that big shift, still checking in, still, being on top of that person and making sure we're following through with conversations that we may have or that we may be worried about. We also know there are risk factors that can play a role in here. So these are things that we experience in our lives or have as part of us. So with our health, as we talked about, mental health conditions, physical health conditions, and traumatic brain injury can definitely increase the risk. We also know having previous attempts, having a family history, or any kind of abuse that somebody maybe has endured. And within their environment, if they're having access to lethal means and they're feeling really down and lonely and depressed, obviously that can increase this risk. Having prolonged stress, so whether it's harassment in the workplace or bullying or having a lot of relationship issues or really struggling financially, that can take a big toll. And then these big events that also can do that. So a divorce, a crisis, a move, a loss of a loved one, all of these can increase that risk around suicide. So when we look at these warning signs and risk factors, we can note that if I'm noticing any of those, 1 of them, 10 of them, doesn't really matter, and I have a gut feeling that somebody may be thinking about suicide, we want to equip you with skills to actually do something about it. So what we have found to be the most helpful, if we have true concern that somebody may be suicidal, is to really get involved. So the best thing here is not to wait. Very often our kind of go-to is, well, let me just give them the weekend to cool off or to figure some things out. What we discussed earlier is that if we are noticing that somebody is showing signs of this, that usually we see something happen within a week or within even 24 hours of those warning signs. So we want to intervene sooner than later. If you're sitting here and you're like, this is just not in my wheelhouse, this is not something I could ever do, that is totally fine. But we do have to find somebody who can. We don't want to just leave that out there. To the best of our ability, we want to do this in a situation that is comfortable, that we have time, that we have space, that we have privacy, to really have this conversation. Now that a lot of our world is kind of in this virtual setting, it doesn't mean that we wait until we're in person with them and have this beautiful setting. If the only way I can connect with that person is through phone or through Zoom, it is okay to do that. Maybe not ideal, but it's better than doing nothing at all. And then we do want to have resources handy. So you are also lucky to have your own kind of phone number around this. And the next slide, or next few slides will highlight some of these resources some more, but just making sure you have that phone number in your phone, especially if you're concerned about another Buff4Life. Also here is the Colorado Crisis Line, which can be really helpful if you are not in Colorado. There's the National Suicide Lifeline as well. Our National Suicide Lifeline, it typically will link up with a more local crisis center depending on your area code. So if you're in a different state, you can kind of navigate that, but that's a great phone number that we have as well. Also just thinking about what connections you have within your own community. Are there, mental health services? Are there crisis lines? Are there counselors, therapists? Any information, just making sure we have those phone numbers in our phone. We'll put another slide up here in a little bit of more resources as well. So once we kind of have an idea of, I need to talk to this person, I need to do something, we want to make sure we're asking very direct questions. So with suicide, this is a tough thing to ask about, but the more direct we are, and the more we are able to have these conversations, the more we have the ability to get people to help they need. Now, there's not a lot of ways you can mess up asking this. Obviously, it's going to depend on your relationship, depend on your style, who you are and what you see. But these are just some examples of how we can ask that question. We can do a check-in, right? How are things going? What's going on? Tell me what's happening. I'm a little concerned. Have you been unhappy lately? And maybe get some information, and we build up on that information until we get to a point where like, hey, I am a little concerned. Have you been so unhappy lately? You've been thinking about ending your life. So it can kind of come up a little bit more naturally through a conversation. We can also name what we're seeing, when people are as upset as you seem to be, or when they're going through some difficult things like you are right now, they sometimes wish they were dead, and wondering if you're thinking that too. Or you look pretty sad or mad or angry or upset. I'm concerned. I'm wondering if you're thinking about suicide. Or as very straightforward as, are you thinking about killing yourself, or are you thinking of suicide? So as you can see in all of these examples, I'm still very much getting to the point of asking about ending their life, killing themselves, and suicide. We want to use that direct language so that nothing gets lost in translation. Now, this is super easy for me to rattle off here behind a screen. This is never going to be easy. This is never going to be a simple task. So I think it's important to note that. Also really important to know, how do I make sure that I'm prepared for this? I always recommend, whether you're driving in your car by yourself or you're home by yourself, say these words out loud, see what comes out, see what you feel comfortable with, so that when you are in a situation that you may be in a crisis, that you've said this before and it's not the first time. So although there's a lot of different ways to ask the question, there are two ways that have been proven to be not as effective. The first one is asking about hurting yourself. So hurting yourself and killing yourself are two different things. So if we're concerned about suicide, we want to make sure we're asking very direct questions, like I said earlier. Along with that, we want to make sure that when we ask these questions, that we're also asking in an open way. We want somebody to say no. We do not want them to be thinking about suicide. So often we'll say, well, you're not thinking of suicide, are you? And the problem with that is it doesn't sound like we're open or ready to have that conversation. So it can really shut down that dialogue that we may have. So really the two things we want to kind of keep in the back of our mind is, how can I ask this in an open way? And how can I ask this directly? And if we have that, then we really see that we're able to really start a really meaningful conversation. Once we, have these conversations, once we ask that question, and if somebody says yes, The best tool that we have is just to be a good listener and just to say, tell me what's going on. It is very natural for us to want to fix things and make things better and make things go away. Unfortunately, there's not a word, a sentence, a phrase that's just going to make this disappear. So listening is a skill set that we all have, that we can all contribute to, and say, well, tell me what's going on. A lot of times we'll kind of say things like, oh, but you got this great job, or you have this wonderful family. Why would you want to do this? As much as we're trying to make things better, at times that can place some more shame or guilt. So we kind of want to think about less is more of, you know, hey, I'm here for you. I want you to live. We'll figure this out together. Those really hopeful statements of us being there for them can go a much further way than trying to fix things or trying to prove something to a person. So I like this example of kind of, well, how do I follow up with a yes? Is, you know, just thank you for telling me. Tell me what's going on. Listen to them and then say, you know what, let's figure out how we're going to get you some help. I want you to know I care about you and I'm here to support you. Again, those little statements can go a really long way. And so to kind of highlight the importance of this, we're going to watch a short clip talking a little bit more about this.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
All right. So again, just kind of a good reminder of it's not necessarily what you say, but just that connection, being there with somebody and being supportive. So once we kind of listen and connect, the next thing we want to do is make sure we're getting to them to the help that they need. Ideally, you are with that person to make that connection. So you can be with that person. It can be a 3-way call. It can be sitting down together, and you can call the Buff4Life crisis line, which can be really helpful to utilize in the moment when you need to. You also have the option, let's say it's not in that realm, to call the National Suicide Lifeline, connect with a doctor, a therapist. But again, you're part of that, saying, let's sit down and call your doctor. Let's sit down and call the National Suicide Lifeline together and kind of make a game plan together. sometimes we're not the best match for that. And so we get other people involved, you know, your wife, your husband, your mom, your sister, you guys are going to kind of tackle this together. And I'm going to wait and make sure we have that connection before we move forward. So we kind of get that connection and do that warm handoff. In certain instances, you know, if somebody is like, yes, I have been thinking about suicide, but, you know, I've got an appointment with my doctor tomorrow and I'm going to talk to him about this. If you feel as though that person is safe, this can definitely be an option. We just definitely want to follow up and say, okay, I'm going to check in with you at 10 o'clock tomorrow and see how that call went. We also know that 911 is always an option. We really want to utilize 911 when we feel that somebody is in immediate danger, but in other instances where we maybe know they're in a safe place or there's other people around that can make sure they're safe, these crisis lines and different options are a great fit as well. So you have a lot of different ways that you can address this. And really, this is the most important part, is that we're getting them to the support and to the help that they may need. I know that's a lot of information. I'm going to really quickly, before we go into questions, have Kat talk a little bit more about some of the resources that you can utilize. Again, this is thinking a little bit more preventative, but thinking about some of those that may be a good option just to kind of keep our mental well-being in a healthy spot.
Thank you, Alex, for all of that. And I know there will likely be questions, but one of the things I talked about at the top of this webinar was Buffs for Life mission to kind of remove some of the barriers and make getting help and taking care of yourself more approachable and just easier to do, because there can be added stress on just trying to find help sometimes. And one of kind of the, you know, base levels is kind of what I refer to as a self-service tool. And Calm is a really good resource for this. And Calm is a nationally recognized app that is available on all platforms. And they have all sorts of options to help you reduce stress, anxiety, meditation. For parents, they have sleep and bedtime stories if you just need to help kind of calm the household down and really learn how to focus on taking care of yourself and self-improvement. So what we're doing today for folks that have been able to join us is in the email that you will receive tomorrow, just thanking you for joining us today, there will actually be a link to a form for you to fill out. And once you fill out that form, it will come back to our group, and we, as Buffs for Life, are offering 1 free year of their premium services on the Calm app. And it's just really an opportunity to kind of get in there and dig around and see if you can find some more peace for yourself, lower your stress and anxiety, and work on your whole health. So really, if you're not familiar with the app, feel free to drop questions. I'm Kat with a K at buffs4life.org, and I recommend this to all of my athletes on a regular basis. And it is backed by, you know, several well-known individuals, including LeBron and just various people in the space. It is funded and designed by those in the mental health sector and academia. So it is backed by science, and we're hoping that folks will learn to take advantage of it and take care of yourselves. So if anyone has any questions for Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, and so I'll open it up now for any questions. I'll put this back in case you want to email me. You're free to do that, but open it up to any questions people may have.
Yeah, Alex, Sean Tufts. How do you feel like text messaging reflects reality?
Just in general, like just.
Yeah, I can. Usually calling someone, they'll hang up, and usually, can you hear me? It's like really echoey.
Yeah, I can hear you. There's no echo.
Okay. Usually I'll call someone and they'll respond back, and we could get into a longer text chat than I could a communication with them. And sometimes that's hard. And it's happening now. I said, "Hey buddy, how you doing?" He said, "I don't know, I'm still here." And then that's kind of where we lost it. Like, where do you go from there?
Yeah, so, you know, ideally in person's best, right? Then it's like, then phone or a Zoom where you can see their face. And then we look at, okay, well, what other options do I have? If you can get them on the phone, that is ideal, where we can have a conversation and really talk, and you can hear tone, you can hear kind of affects of how they're feeling, those kinds of things. So it's ideal. But if somebody's not answering, if somebody's not communicating in that way, and you're able to communicate with them through text, that is okay as well. What we do see, like the National Suicide Lifeline, they have a text line now. And so it is our world that we live in. It's not ideal, but if that's the only way we can connect, then it is kind of a viable option. I would try first to get on the phone, like, hey, do you mind if I give you a call real quick? Just kind of want to hear your voice or talk to you real quick, just to kind of have that conversation. And then we can kind of connect from there. But again, if it's your only option, then it's something we don't want to push aside and just not do it because of that.
So when you get some of those, like, not misleading, but like pessimistic text, it's best to respond back with, hey, can we talk? I miss you.
Exactly.
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah. If you can get them on the phone, that would be great. If you're like, oh, this feels a little weird, be like, hey, well, do you mind if I give you a call real quick? I'd love to hear what's going on or hear how you're doing. And if they're like, no, then you can kind of say, well, tell me what's going on. And you can kind of grab some of that information through text. But if you can get them on the phone, I think we get a little bit more of what we're needing through that.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I know, Derek, you had asked about the prevalence of mental health and suicide earlier in the presentation. Do you feel throughout the rest of the presentation you got some of the, at least a little bit perspective and information? And you can type an answer. I'm not sure you'll be able to go off mute. All right, well, I know we are a minute after, but I want to extend a huge thanks to Alex and the time that she has spent with us putting this together and being with us today. As I expected, Alex, you did amazing, and it is forever helpful that you are here to kind of help walk us through some of these pieces that can be uncomfortable to talk about, but obviously very necessary. So if anyone has any questions, you will receive an email. And I was going to toss, let's see, Alex, I need to snag the host back from you, I think, to be able to.
Okay, here we go. Let me see here if I can do that. I'm going to make you host. There you go.
Okay, so I'm going to put out a quick 3-question poll just about if you felt this was useful and if you feel informed after this. And that last question is just if you would be interested in additional workshops like this around mental health and complete health. And with that, you will receive an email with links tomorrow. And thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day for a really important topic.
Hey, Kat, it says hosts and panelists cannot vote. So you might need to change permission there.
Well, we are hosts and panelists. We're not the people attending the webinar.
Right.
So you don't need to vote, Sean.
I'm smiling in the background.
All right, we have an 80% participation. I'll take it. So thank you so much, everyone, and look forward to hearing from you for those Calm premium subscriptions.